last few weeks, we've been talking about families. Some important families in the Bible, but our own families too. In every story we've talked about so far, at least one family member has messed up big time. We've heard stories of lies, deceit, disagreements, jealousy, selfishness, and even murder. Sure, some of these situations and dynamics are pretty extreme, but in some ways they may not be all that different from our own family stories. In every family, there are plenty of opportunities to give and receive forgiveness. There are so many reasons why we might need to forgive a family member, especially siblings if we have them. But in some situations, forgiveness is easier to offer than it is in other situations. Answer these would you rather questions for yourself. Would you rather forgive a sibling for eating your candy or eating your pizza? How about this one? Would you rather forgive a sibling for stealing your money or stealing a friend? Would you rather forgive your sibling for lying to you or lying about you to someone else? Some things may be easier to forgive than others. We've all needed to forgive or be forgiven by a family member. In every family, people hurt each other. Typical families let their hurts and offenses go unresolved until they result in bitterness, broken relationships, or maybe even revenge. But atypical families know their relationships with their families are too valuable to lose. So far in this series, we've met the family of Adam and Eve, the family of their descendant, Abraham, and the family of Abraham's grandsons, Jacob and Esau. Today I want to introduce you to another generation of the same family, Jacob's son Joseph and his brothers. It's another great story filled with lots of great details, but today we're going to focus specifically on Joseph's relationship with his brothers. Let's get a quick overview of Joseph's story and then we'll look more closely at the details.
So Jacob goes on from there to have 12 sons, big family. But Jacob loves his 11th son, Joseph, way more than all the others. And so he gives him the special Technicolor dream coat. And his brothers, because of this, come to hate him.
So much so that they plan on killing him.
But they don't. They instead just sell him as a slave down in Egypt.
Now that we have the big picture of the beginning of Joseph's story, let's pay closer attention to Joseph's relationship with his family. When you read Genesis 37, you realize there were some interesting dynamics within this family. Joseph is his father's favorite, clearly, and he isn't quiet about it. Joseph decides it's a good idea to tell his brothers that someday they will all serve him. For obvious reasons, his brothers didn't like to hear that. So one day, Joseph's brothers are working hard in the fields. Joseph heads out to meet them, wearing his fancy coat, of course. Imagine you and your siblings are outside sweating in the sun. While you're hard at work, your brother, which is your dad's favorite, comes strutting over to you wearing his fancy clothes while you're covered in sweat and dirt. Clearly, he has not come to lend you a hand. Joseph's brothers are so tired of Joseph, his attitude, his favorite status, and his dreams about how he would someday be their ruler. In anger and in jealousy, they throw Joseph into a well, stage his death, and then end up selling him into slavery. Now, I've needed to forgive family members before, but I've never had to forgive anyone for something like this.
Now, while in Egypt, through this crazy series of events, Joseph goes from being in a prison cell to becoming the second in command there.
And so later on, the whole Middle East falls into this food shortage. And Joseph's brothers, they come down to Egypt looking for food. And then when they get there, who should they find as the ruler of the whole land?
It's Joseph, that guy they sold into slavery. But he actually saves them from starving to death.
And so here you have it. These are the great-grandchildren of Abraham who have done this heinous act to their brother. But God has transformed their evil into something good.
Joseph saves the lives of his brothers and forgives them for what they did to him. Joseph forgives his brothers, but when their father Jacob dies, the brothers get scared. Joseph is going to change his mind and try to get revenge on them. They know they haven't deserved the forgiveness and kindness that Joseph has given to them. But listen how Joseph responds to their fears. Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." Joseph had a good reason to be angry at his brothers, but instead, Joseph chose forgiveness instead of bitterness. Many years after Joseph forgave his brothers, Jesus preached a sermon to a group of his followers. Last week, we highlighted part of that sermon about having tough conversations. After those words, Peter comes up to Jesus and asks him, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times?" Jesus answered, "I tell you, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. Jesus goes on to tell a parable about a man who had been forgiven a huge debt. It was forgiveness that he didn't deserve. But when someone asked this same man to forgive them of their debt, he refused. Here was Jesus' point. God has forgiven you of so much. So extend that forgiveness to each other. The kind of forgiveness Joseph showed his brothers isn't typical. I mean, it's hard to understand it, but that's the kind of forgiveness God has shown to us through Jesus. Throughout this series, we've been saying that if you want God to use your family to do atypical things, sometimes you have to be the first person in your family to do something atypical. That's what Joseph did, and that's what Jesus teaches us to do. Not so typical families forgive each other. Tonight, during our Zoom hangout, we will talk about some action steps we can all take toward forgiveness. Now, I want to acknowledge that this conversation might be confusing to some people. You might have a family member who has hurt you so deeply or so repeatedly that the idea of forgiving them like Joseph forgave his brothers seems impossible. So let me be clear. If anyone in your family or not in your family has hurt you or continues to hurt you either physically, emotionally, or sexually, we need to have a different conversation. If this is your story, God is not telling you to move on, to be nice to them, or protect them from the consequences of their actions. That's not the point of this conversation. If this is your story, here's what I want you to do. Tell an adult today. Don't hesitate. You can reach out to any one of our student ministry adult team members. We would love to chat with you. We'd love to talk to you so we can help you walk through what you are dealing with. We want you to know you are not alone. I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation on forgiveness tonight at 8 o'clock on Zoom. I hope you can join us then.